Alain de Benoist is a French philosopher and social and political commentator. In 1968, he established the nationalist think tank, the Research and Study Group for European Civilization, and became one of the leading minds of the so-called European New Right, a term Benoist does not wholeheartedly accept. His books include The Problem of Democracy, Beyond Human Rights, On Being a Pagan, as well as studies of Friedrich Nietzsche, Carl Schmitt, and Ernst Jünger. It is my great pleasure and it's an honor to introduce Alain de Benoist. It's good to finally meet you.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Ladies and gentlemen, before I start off with my speech, I would like to apologize for having an obligation to inflict some pain on you. Listening to a speech in the English language with a French accent as awful as mine may indeed turn out to be a kind of torture for you. And I have also the impression that this conference has been already somewhat invaded by French speakers. But rest assured, I'm much better in French. As you can guess, the subject of my speech is the notion of identity. In a famous passage from his Confessions, Saint Augustine writes, "What is time? If nobody asks me about this, well, then I know its meaning. But if somebody asks me about it, and if I try to explain it, I do not know it any longer." Saint Augustine's remarks about time could also be used regarding identity. Identity poses no problems as long as nobody asks questions about it. Identity is then taken for granted. It comes as something natural. Yet, a totally different situation arises the minute we ask ourselves, who am I? Or who are we? Or better yet, what does that mean to be an American? Qui est français? Or was ist Deutsch? It is not at all easy to talk about identity because contrary to what many people believe, starting with those who want to defend identity, identity is not a simple concept. It is rather a very complex issue. Identity is a complex topic because it emerges as a problem precisely at a moment when it is no longer taken as something given. In this sense, identity is a typically modern subject. In traditional societies, no one ever questions his or her identity, the reason being that it is taken for granted by all as something self-evident. Hence, my first remark, it is at a moment when identity, be it individual or collective identity, is under threat or has already disappeared, that one begins asking questions as to what identity is all about. This is the case today, and this is the reason why identity has become such a burning issue, both on the political and the ideological level. Identity has become a problematic issue in the modern and the postmodern age in view of the fact that its reference points are fading away and in view of the fact that no one really knows any longer now what makes the meaning of life. Moreover, it cannot just be a simple coincidence that identities have become so problematic in the modern age. This indicates that modernity has been the vehicle of an evolution directly harming all identities. This evolution is primarily due to the rise of individualism, whose roots go, for example, to Descartes and his teachings, to say the least. In the Descartes teachings, there is indeed a sublimation of the subject that prompted this author to attribute to the individual a kind of ontological solitude, whereby the individual, in order to exist, must henceforth dispense with any community. Political atomism, which appeared in the 17th century, especially with the social contract theories by Grotius, Pufendorf, John Locke, and others, was one of its consequences. Another reason why the subject of identity appears so complex lies in the fact that identity, be it individual or collective, cannot be only reduced to one dimension in the life of individuals and peoples. Identity is never one-dimensional. It is multi-dimensional. Our identity combines inherited components with those that we choose ourselves. We have a national identity, a linguistic identity, a political identity, a cultural identity, an ethnic identity, a sexual identity, a professional identity, and so on. All these different aspects define our objective identity. But experience teaches us that identity carries also a subjective dimension. In general, we define ourselves by referring to the aspect of our identity which appears as the most important and the most critical one to us, while more or less ignoring other aspects of identity. This means that our identity is inseparable from what matters most to us. It expresses a part of ourselves that we cherish most and on which we lean in order to construct ourselves. Which is the part of ourself that defines us, in our opinion, in the most essential manner? This is the question we have to answer when elaborating our identity. In order to describe what matters most to us, the Canadian sociologist Charles Taylor speaks of strong evaluations and constitutive goods. Constitutive goods stand in a sharp contrast to material goods, or for that matter, to goods emanating from some physical need, insofar as they are not identifiable to simple preferences, but are instead the very foundations of our identity. Strong evaluations are characterized by the fact that they are not negotiable and cannot be reduced to a simple whim. They are not related to material well-being, but to the very being of ourselves. These evaluations relate to everything that provides a reason to live and to die. That is to say, they have strong bearing on the values that are conceived as intrinsically good. Having made these preliminary remarks, I would like to mention now two errors which are generally made when one talks about identity. The first error is to believe that our identity depends only on ourselves. In reality, though, our identity is also shaped by the relationship we have with others, with the views we have about others, and by the views others have about ourselves. An isolated individual, a man or a group living alone by himself and by itself respectively, cut off from other people or other groups, has no identity. Let's put it differently. There is no such thing as identity emerging from one's self only. Identity certainly means something that gives a meaning to life. However, in view of the fact that life cannot be lived on the individual level only, the subject of identity must necessarily imply a social dimension. Identity cannot be conceived independently of the social bond. It is always the group that assigns an individual a part of his identity, either through history, languages, or institutions. This means that identity cannot be framed on the sidelines by the subject himself, but only from the subject's relationship with the identity of others. Every identity, I would say, is fundamentally dialogical in its nature. The statement that each identity is fundamentally dialogical means that the other also makes up my identity because he enables me to fulfill myself. By contrast, individualism conceives of its relationship with the other only through the perspective of mutually vested interests. From the communitarian perspective, which is also my perspective, social relationship is part of myself. As Charles Taylor notes, the other is also an element of my inner identity. A group, just as an individual, must face up to the significant others. The second big mistake is to define identity as something within us that remains forever immutable and unchangeable. In this case, whether we talk about an individual or a people, identity is conceived as an essence founded on invariable and intangible attributes. But identity is not an essence or a fact of the matter thing or a static reality. Identity is rather a substance which has its own dynamic reality. Identity does not reflect singularity only, or a permanent nature of such singularity. Continuity also includes change, just as the definition of self involves relationship with the other. There cannot be any identity without some process of transformation. The important factor is that we should never look at these two terms as contradicting each other. Identity is not something which never changes, but rather something which permits to change without, however, ceasing to be ourselves. Finally, I must say that identity is not an object that needs to be discovered, but also an object that needs to be interpreted. Human life, as was well argued by philosophers such as Wilhelm Dilthey, Hans-Georg Gadamer, and Paul Ricoeur, is fundamentally interpretive in its nature. That is to say, that to live does not mean only describing objects, but also attempting to assign meaning to objects. Man, writes Taylor, is an animal who interprets himself. Nor does identity escape this rule. Identity is a definition of oneself, partly implicit, which a person belabors and redefines throughout his life. Identity is fundamentally narrative in its nature. Well, now, what threatens most collective identities today? To this question, many will respond by pointing to the phenomenon of mass immigration, with most Western countries being its central stage. The severity and importance of this phenomenon cannot be denied, nor can one deny social pathologies resulting from immigration. This view, however, in my opinion, misses the essential point because this view does not focus enough on the causes of immigration, and in addition, it lacks the right caliber approach. For my part, I should say that what poses the biggest threat to collective identities today is what has been called the system that kills the people. That is to say, the imposition of an across-the-board system of global homogenization that eliminates all human diversity, diversity of the peoples, of language and cultures. This system is associated with the notion of global governance and the global market. Its underlying goal is the erasure of the boundaries, the borders, the limits, in favor of a unified world. I call this system the ideology of sameness, the ideology of the same. Therefore, I do not belong to those who will argue that our identity is primarily threatened by the identity of others. Although of course, such a threat may exist. I think that the greatest danger waiting now upon identity does not only threaten our identity, but also the identity of all other peoples. The greatest danger is the rise of indistinction, the erasure of differences, the destruction of shared values and popular cultures and lifestyles in a globalized world in which the only recognized value are those expressed by the price tags, the exchange value, that is to say, by money. That's why, for me, the big question in the coming years will be, are we headed towards a unified, unipolar world where differences will disappear, or are we headed to a multipolar world where identities will retain some value and meaning. Universum or pluriversum. Asking this question inevitably leads us to the question regarding the meaning of modernity, especially the meaning of the philosophy of the Enlightenment, which happened to be its driving force in the 18th century. Why is the philosophy of the Enlightenment inherently hostile to collective identities? Well, being fundamentally oriented towards the future, it demonizes the notions of tradition, of custom, of rootedness, seeing in those notions outdated superstitions and obstacles to the triumphal march towards progress. Having as a goal the unification of mankind, the theory of progress implies that one must therefore discard any archaic bondage, that is to say, refute all former bonds, and systematically destroying all organic and symbolic foundation of traditional solidarity. The dynamics of modernity tears man asunder from his natural communal ties and disregards his insertion in a specific humanity, because such notions are based on an atomistic conception of society, conceived as a simple sum of fundamentally free and rational individuals who are all supposed to choose their own goals when guiding their actions. This is why the Enlightenment heritage is opposed to the maintenance of identities. Surprisingly, at least for me, many American conservatives seems to be partisans, adherents of methodological individualism. They believe that the individuals are more important than the communities or collectivities. They believe more in individual rights than in collective or people's right. This is the reason why they are opposed also to state intervention, but also to any form of economic and financial regulation which they usually associate with, quotation mark, socialism. This view, in my opinion, prevents them from understanding that disintegration of collective identity is directly linked to the rise of individualism, causing the colonization of their imaginary, their mindset, by economic and commercial values and the generalized axiomatic of interest. Like many Europeans, I mean continental Europeans, I am amazed that American conservatives defend almost unanimously the capitalist system, whose expansion methodically keeps destroying everything they want to conserve. Despite the structural crisis of the capitalist system over the last couple of years, American conservatives continue with their celebration of capitalism as the only system that purportedly respects and guarantees individual liberty, private property, and free trade. They believe in the intrinsic virtues of the market, whose mechanism is thought to be the paradigm for all social relations. They believe that capitalism has something to do, is intertwined with democracy and freedom. They believe in the necessity and possibility of perpetual economic growth. Pierrot spoke about this topic this morning. They think that consumption is a part of happiness and that more is always synonymous with better. Capitalism, however, has nothing conservative in itself. It is the very opposite. Karl Marx already observed, quite rightly, that the dismantling of feudalism and the eradication of traditional cultures and ancient values are the result of capitalism, which in turn drowns everything in the, he said, the icy waters of egotistical calculation. Today, the capitalist system, more than ever before, is poised toward the over-accumulation of capital. It needs more trade outlets, always more and more markets, more exchange, more profits. Well, such a goal cannot be achieved unless it dismantles first everything that stands in its way, starting with collective identities. A full-fledged market economy cannot operate in a sustained manner unless most people have internalized a fashionable culture, consumption without any end, and unlimited growth. Capitalism cannot transform the world into a vast market, which is its main goal, unless the planet becomes itself unified and unless the planet renounces on all forms of symbolic imagination, which needs to be now replaced by the fever for always something new, as well as for the logic of profit and limitless accumulation. This is the reason why capitalism, in its attempt to erase or suppress the borders, is also a system that has turned out to be much more effective than communism. Capitalism is much more internationalist and materialistic than communism. The reason for this is that the economic logic places profits above everything else. In his time, Adam Smith wrote already that the merchant has no fatherland, no homeland, other than the place where he makes the biggest profit. And that's why capitalism bears prime responsibility for immigration. On the one hand, the youth of immigrants enables a downward pressure on workers' wages. On the other, the very principle of capitalism, laissez-faire, laissez-passer, includes free movement of people, hand in hand with free movement of goods and capital. Hence, the reason why capital requires increased labor mobility and accordingly continuous migration of labor across national borders, seen by capitalists as an obstacle to increased trade. From this point of view, the world market has become the natural setting for global citizenship. The market society offers only a caricature of the social bond since it defines the independence from others as the only true and normal existence of the individual. Meanwhile, it commodifies social relationship, that is to say, the relationship between human beings must turn into a carbon copy of the relationship towards and between things, commodities. This commodification of humans, in German Verdinglichung, is inseparable from the logic of capitalism. From the point of view of capital, men are objects merchandise. Indeed, they can only be agents in the production and consumption process and are solely interconnected through the exchange of goods and the confrontations of interests. With capitalism becoming a total social fact. Total social fact is a formula by sociologist Marcel Mauss. Each object must be therefore reduced to its commercial value. Everything must be catalogued as a merchandise, the latter being promoted to the rank of ultimate reality. Accordingly, anything lacking a monetary equivalent must be considered as unimportant or even non-existent. Yet, market values, commercial values, utilitarian values, and vested interest values, as they are always arranged in terms of quantity only, are absolutely opposed to non-computable and non-measurable measurable values which happen to be pivotal in the existence of cultures and peoples. This is the reason why identities will remain under threat as long as we refuse to put into questions all kinds of alienated lifestyles that are structurally related to the capitalist worldview, which advocates everlasting growth and limitless consumption. I am quite aware that this is not easy to convey to the United States, a birthplace of modern capitalism, a country which puts the individuals above the community and which has always believed in the intrinsic merits of the market, in the virtues of technology, of free exchange, in the reality of progress, and whose political thought, ever since the age of the founding fathers, have been based on the key assumption of the Enlightenment, Messianic universalism, the theory of rights, and the ideology of progress. I'm fully aware of that, and my intention was certainly not to be provocative. I was asked to give my opinion on identity. I gave it. It remains for me now only to thank you for having the great patience to listen to me. Thank you.